Hi BookTube. Today I'm going to do a book chat about The Language Instinct, How the Mind Creates Language by Steven Pinker. It was published in 1994 by Harper Perennial Modern Classics, and actually Steven Pinker was up for the Pulitzer Prize in 1998 for his other book called How the Mind Works. And he was a finalist for that one. The winner of that Pulitzer that year was Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a pretty amazing book. I've read it. That one's a pretty amazing one. So The Language Instinct, it was published before that one. It's one of his earlier works, so it's his first actual nonfiction book. And his main point of view for this is that language is something that every single human being has, and it's just a natural part of being human. And he covers a myriad of different topics that relate to his thesis. And I'll go through this book chat just covering a little bit of each chapter, just not the key point, but something interesting that could kind of pull you in and make you want to read the book. So just one theme that would not be a real spoiler, because I do think that even nonfiction could have spoilers, and I don't like to do that for anything, whether it be fiction or nonfiction. So the first one is from chapter 1. This quote that you see on the screen is from page 14 in the book. And basically he's just giving like an overview, an introduction to the language and the art that language actually could be. So he opens his book with a really good definition of cognitive science. He says it combines the tools from psychology, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and neurobiology to explain the workings of human intelligence. And he just goes on to say about how much this field is exploding in terms of knowledge and progress and research and advancements. And the first chapter is basically just an overview of what his book is looking to cover. The next chapter that I wanted to mention is from Mentalese. Basically, he's starting to talk about how the mind actually creates language, or how does the mind think? Because language and thinking, he separates the two of them. And he says that like some inspiration and some ideas are generated from a non-language point of view, where the most creative people, they can actually think in a non-linear or non-language way. They can almost call images to mind, or when you get into abstract thinking, it's free of language, and then somehow you have to translate those abstract ideas into language. And he just goes on and explains a lot of details about how that works. I do like in his chapter How Language Works, he explains a really interesting idea. He says, the way language works then is that each person's brain contains a lexicon or list of words and the concepts they stand for. It's like a mental dictionary, and a set of rules that combine the words to convey relationships among concepts, which is a mental grammar. So basically he's saying that inside everybody's mind there's a list of words that they know, and that word is attached to a definition and the grammar that applies to it, and then that's how we can create sentences and then conversations and dialogue and thoughts and everything. So pretty neat if you think about how one word can have that many pieces of information attached to it. And then once he gets into how children learn languages, it becomes even more fascinating, because children do they have this information already? But if they do, then how do you explain children from different languages? Because each language has its own vocabulary and its own set of grammar and definitions. So once he gets to that chapter, it gets pretty interesting where he takes that point. And basically, for the chapter on how language works, he gets right down to the nitty-gritty, and he explains it almost like an interesting machine, or some interesting... He explains all of its moving parts, and yeah, he goes into all kinds of things. And then once he gets to his chapter on words, he says that people must have a mental rule for generating new words from old ones. So a word, we could create a new word using a prefix or suffix, and it's going to make sense because it's following that type of rule that we have that's just inherent in our language use. Where, for example, if you put in a whole bunch of words into a computer and you ask the computer to generate new words, it's going to produce awkward and non-English sounding words. Whereas if you ask a person to do that, they can be more creative about creating new words, and they sound like real words. And it's because they're following that innate, something that's innate in us, that he's trying to, like the language instinct, what he's trying to show to us in this book. Some suffixes and some prefixes, they should work with a word, but for some reason they don't, and we don't commonly use those together. Once he gets to his chapter called The Sounds of Silence, things get really pretty interesting. He just illustrates how amazing our sense of hearing is when it comes to language. Because the main thing that stands out the most is when we speak, we say a whole entire sentence, maybe 3 or 4 sentences, and we don't say a pause between each word unless we're really emphasizing something and it comes across as very rude. But when we're writing, there's spaces between each word. And he says that it's just amazing that we can, how fast we can take in language through sound and break it down and take the meaning from it. And the way that he explains it is just simply amazing. He gives actual numbers for how fast we can do this. And this is one of the biggest problems when it comes to computers and trying to dictate word or language to a computer so that they can type it out. Because even the best computer is nowhere near as good as a human being when it comes to deciphering language. And then another interesting thing that he mentions that I think is pretty cool, I want to read a whole book on this. It's called phonetic symbolism. And it's basically, you know, like onomatopoeia, or when you hear meow, meow, or woof, woof, like this kind of things. You can generally say what that sound, how it makes you feel. And it goes a lot more into that, where the phonetics or the sound, like father, the A in father, or the O in core, or in cot, remind people of large things, and tiny things are teeny and squeak, but elephants are humongous and roar. That it just has just a single vowel, but that vowel is phonetic symbolism. It's just fascinating. And that can apply to other languages. For example, in his book he says English speakers correctly guess that the Chinese qing means light and cheng means heavy. It's very cool. And he gives some more examples on that, but it's just fascinating. And also, we can also hear, how can we decipher what someone is saying to us in a loud concert hall or a loud music rock concert or something? We can still understand what people are saying when they're yelling over all that loud background music. Also, in his chapter on the sounds of silence, he also talks about alphabets, and he defends the way alphabets are now. He says that they should not be changed to be 100% accurate to the sound of language, because the purpose of writing is for reading, and we need to be able to see the word, as opposed to see how it sounds, because it's too different between the two. Yeah, so basically he goes into a lot more detail about that. But I think maybe I agree. Like, it makes it really difficult for language speakers to learn English because the spelling and the pronunciation are so different when you see them in writing. Yeah, make it into like a phonetic for them to learn, or just try to let them learn it the best that they can, possibly, and their fluency will improve the more they learn the language. So then his next chapter is on talking heads, and it's basically about computers and language. Some of the barriers for improving, I guess, computational linguistics. Some of the barriers are also the differences between humans using languages and machines using languages. One of the benefits of machines learning language, or computers specifically, is like subtitles. And deaf people and people with different language barriers, this could help them. Like, if, for example, if you're traveling to another country, I saw an app where they're trying to, you could take a picture of a book or like a food menu, and then it would translate it into your own language. Would the benefits outweigh the cost of that type of language access? It's something interesting to ponder. And then, of course, you have a lot of the ethical things with computers learning languages and stuff. He outlines it like he's taking it from a scientific point of view, not so much the ethical point of view. They should be kept together. They should never be separated. But he says that the biggest problem for languages and learning them is the hard part for people and computers is opposite and different. It turns out that the memory part is easy for computers and hard for people, and the decision-making part is easy for people and hard for computers. Meaning that if you say a really long, bloated sentence, it is difficult for a human to be able to remember all of the points in that sentence and then to be able to understand it because of their memory shortage. Whereas a computer, they have a lot more memory, short-term memory, than people do, or long-term memory. And the decision-making part is when you're stringing together words in a sentence, the person who's listening has to decide what the meaning is going to be, or what the meaning is. And each word, as it's added to the sentence, gives a clue to the listener about what the subject of the sentence is and what the sentence is going to mean. That's where an example of a garden path sentence would come into play, where if you start talking about a cat and you suddenly, halfway through the sentence, the subject changes to a teapot, then the person's not going to understand the sentence the first time around. They have to recall it, and then they could remember it, because you led them astray when you're saying a sentence. So there's a lot of jokes that can come out of this, or comedy and stuff, because we can find a sense of humor in that if it's told in a right way, because we're led to expect something and something else comes out of it, and we find that comical and funny. Whereas a computer, that would stumble a computer and they would not be able to go back and understand it, because the computer cannot make decisions for comprehension, whereas a person can. And it's pretty interesting. And then, of course, once you get into the ethical discussion about that, if computers should be learning language or not, what are the benefits or downsides of that. Once he gets to the chapter on Babel, he talks about linguistic diversity. It's such an interesting topic. I don't want to talk too much about this one because it is the best chapter in the book, in my opinion. Basically, he's just talking about how languages are different, where they came from, the quest for the one original language. And they are, if there's so many different languages, why are there different languages? Like, why do we speak so many, why is there so much diversity on the world for languages? And then he says, to understand why there is more than one language, we must understand the effects of innovation, learning, and migration. And he traces all of that in his book. And he goes through some of the roots of English to show the decline of English, or the how English has changed over time. He shows the Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, and then Contemporary English. And then he shows American English versus British English and how they are different, and what American English, the deep South American English, has preserved that British English has actually lost. So in some ways, if you want to say one of the languages declined, British English possibly declined versus the deep South American English, which would be flipping that stereotype on its head. And he goes into detail of what that is. So I think it's pretty interesting. Once he gets into the chapter about babies, this is one of my favorite chapters, another one. He talks about how every single baby is born with 100% of the world's sounds in its mind or in its ear. And then it starts eliminating the sounds that are not in its parents' native language. And it starts focusing in on the sounds that it's going to need for its language learning or acquisition. And he says, babies continue to learn the sounds of their language throughout the first year. By 6 months, they're beginning to lump together the distinct sounds that their language collapses into a single sound or phoneme, while continuing to discriminate equivalently distinct ones that their language keeps separate. By 10 months, they're no longer universal babies in terms of language, but they've turned into their parents. They keep only their parents' sound by 10 months. Basically, their language acquisition starts with eliminating other languages and keeping only the sounds that their parents are making or their caretakers are making. That way they can learn the language of their caretakers, and they can get rid of the extra or wasteful potentials that they don't need. Like if a baby is born to an English home, they can get rid of all the sounds that the Chinese language would make so that they can only focus in on the English sounds. And then he also explains a little bit about the biology, where during the first year, the speech, all of the muscles and the biological parts for processing speech goes through a huge change, a metamorphosis, I guess you could say. By 3 months, the larynx descends into the throat, and it opens up the vocal cavity behind the tongue, so that they can start to produce the vowel sounds that adults produce. And then, I guess within a few months from that, they can start making more human-like sounding sounds, and less the baby crying sounds. By 7 and 8 months, they suddenly begin to babble like real syllables, like ba 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 and d d d. And these sounds are the same in all languages. They consist of phonemes and syllable patterns that are the most common across languages. By the end of the first year, they're starting to do their little baby talk. Now, one really cool little quote that I really like is, the infant is like a person who has been given a complicated piece of audio equipment bristling with unlabeled knobs and switches, but missing the instruction manual. So cute. It's so amazing how children learn languages. And that's just focusing on the babies. And then I'll skip the next 2 chapters because they're very much into biology. So they're extremely dense chapters for me because I'm not coming at all from a biology background. So the next chapter I'll go to is the language mavens, which is the grammar police. And he really shows his George Carlin style sense of humor in this chapter. He really seems to not like grammar police. He's very much opposed to them, and it shows very comically in his writing. The first paragraph, imagine that you are watching a nature documentary. The video shows the usual gorgeous footage of animals in their natural habitats. But the voiceover reports some troubling facts. Dolphins do not execute their swimming strokes properly. White-crowned sparrows carelessly debase their calls. Chickadees' nests are incorrectly constructed. Pandas hold bamboo in the wrong paw. The song of the humpback whale contains several well-known errors, and monkeys' cries have been in a state of chaos and degeneration for hundreds of years. Your reaction, of course, is going to be, how is that possible? That's how pandas eat. Why would we consider that wrong? So who cares about how the whales make their sounds? He has the same argument for human language. He says that the way that we use language is right, and it's just some snobby folks that are coming out of the woodworks that are trying to police the way that we're using something that's natural to us. So basically that's his book. I hope you like this style of a book chat. It's probably a lot different from what you were expecting on BookTube. But leave comments if you like the style. If I gave like the right type of information that would entice you to want to read this book, or if it's too long or boring, or just whatever you think. And if I inspired like something to talk about with this, then be sure to let me know and leave comments. Okay, and then if you go to my blog, it's in the link. You'll see my actual review. It's like a little profile style review. I've got the top 10. The main attractions is just the outline of the chapters. I ranked it as the hearty veggie burger, and yeah, it's got all that kind of stuff. And then I've also got I've got a packing list and other books to read before getting into this one, and of course a fabulous movie that you should definitely watch. It's a fiction movie. Okay, so that's all. Thanks. Bye, BookTube.